I'd give anything to see you, all of you.
And there we go.
Time.
There's the
not
pact.
The emperor he prayed to.
He's
as
offering
the pain
his soul.
Of his betrayal and broken promise was far too great.
Alright class, settle down and let me tell you a story. We're now at the second part of our WARHAMMER 40K Halloween special. Tonight we have WesHammer's The Summon of Shadows based on Warhammer's horror series. Before we begin, please don't forget to check out his channel and also ours. Please like, share, subscribe, and the whole notification button thing to help us out. And of course, we do this live on Twitch. Please join me, guys. I would love for you guys to be there. So anyways, like he said before in the first part, Warhammer has always been terrifying, but on a macro level. And like I said before, it's as pretty as a forest fire, just as Neil Gaiman described war in his book Good Omens. Beautiful only at a distance. But now we're looking at the nitty-gritty of it all. We are now in the eye of terror. We're not Astartes, we're not even a trained guard, we're just regular old humans. So here we go. Let's see how terrifying or how worse it can get.
Of the 41st millennium, mankind is besieged on all sides by aliens, heretics, mutants, and far worse, eldritch entities beyond human comprehension and abominable.
See, this is what I was talking about when I said, when he said actually, when we checked out that we're looking at it from a macro level. We are looking at it as mere witnesses. And like I said before, this is the reason why I don't play horror games as much as possible, because there's a big difference. Because as the audience, we're simply witnesses to what's happening. There's a guy being torn apart right now. It's happening to him. It's not happening to us. But if you play horror games, you literally step into the shoes of this guy, which isn't good. So the terror comes in twice as heavy. The terror comes in twice as much. So yeah.
Nations that hunger for the flesh of men. The galaxy is certainly a dangerous place, but the Emperor's faithful, through his divine servants and many military factions, are at least afforded a certain degree of safety and the promise that the Emperor protects. However, there are
So in war, not everyone's a soldier.
Planets that exist in the far-flung reaches of the Imperium, bereft of the luxury of protection. Forgotten sectors and abandoned systems where the Emperor's light has grown dim.
So yeah, that meme, every day we stray further from God's light. I remember, historically speaking, after the American Civil War, of course, the aftermath, where this majority of the South was occupied. I mean, that's the reason why there's a ton of forts in the South at present day, for the simple reason that it needed to be occupied. But it left a lot of people hanging, or it left a lot of people in the dust, because the old government was gone and the federal government was now in place. It needed time, it needed resources to recover from the war. But the thing about it is, of course, they're going to prioritize states, or in this case, planets, that's closer to the center, that's closer to Rome. And the farther you are from Rome, the less likely you are to get help, or the less likely you are from protection. And yeah, after that Civil War, a lot of people simply didn't distrusted, or didn't simply have any trust for the federal government or the main government, for the simple reason that they didn't get any help. They weren't here in the first place when we were suffering. Why should we help it now? I mean, why should we even pay our taxes if we're not being protected?
Backwater worlds whose inhabitants are all too often forced to face the
See how it's
terror
described?
of the grimdark future
Backwater
completely
worlds.
Alone. The Summons of
They're on their
Shadows
own.
was a short story written by David Annandale and included in the Warhammer horror anthology Invocations, released in 2019. This is but one of the spine-chilling entries in this anthology, so if you enjoy these scary stories, I implore you to support the original release and help keep the Warhammer horror line alive. I've included a link down in the description below if you'd like to pick up a copy of this book for yourself. In tonight's tale, we travel to a dying Forge world, where scribe Jakob Meltinus will learn that there are more than just servitors and servo skulls lurking within the dark passages of the
This is something. The first story was seen through the eyes of an artist, and now we're actually going to see the story, or you're going to see the horror from the perspective or the point of view of an actual scribe. The thing about scribes or scriveners is that there's always a bit of creativity required for the job. Most of the stories we know from ancient Greece or ancient Rome were seen through the eyes of philosophers, or were seen through the eyes of artists. And, well, there's a big difference between being an artist or being a scribe, or being a philosopher or a mere scribe. A scribe simply, writes it down. No opinion necessary, no other seasoning is necessary when you're writing it down, like writing down a report. 10:23 a.m. guest A arrived. 10:54 a.m. the war began. Shots were fired. So there's a big difference from a person as a military scribe, or just as a plain scribe, writing down history or writing down current events, than as compared to a philosopher or an artist writing it down. Because a philosopher or an artist would definitely infuse or imbue creativity to his work, whereas a scribe merely simply writes it down, like a logbook. So let's see how it goes.
In the Stratum Palace complex, something else is moving silently through the shadows, watching and judging his every move. This is a tale of...
So I wouldn't know how to describe this, because Warhammer 40K is a horror universe, right? Deep down in its essence, it's grim, dark. I mean, you're sacrificing 1,000 souls per day to your god. There's human starch. There's cannibal cults. So, based on that picture we saw, would this constitute a creature feature? Because a creature feature is a genre of horror where there's a large monster or something hunting down people, and they're supposed to survive it. And apparently, it's working in Terra's depths. Because we're looking at this from the point of view of ordinary human beings. In Space Marine 2, we're looking at the Astartes. He was a Primaris Marine. So, for him, looking at the Tyranid, he sees Tyranids as simply another form of an enemy. Whereas, if you're a regular human being, if you're not an Astartes, this is definitely going to look like a nightmare. But a Primaris Ultramarine wouldn't look at it as a nightmare. It's simply a target. That's awesome.
Grief and loss, of madness and monsters, of the consequences of broken promises, and mankind's utter helplessness in the face of an uncaring galaxy. So come with me, my friends. Gather round and listen well as we dive into another terrifying entry in the grimdark story hour. Our story begins within the bowels of the Administratum Palace complex on the dying forge world of Fumis, here in one of the labyrinthian facilities.
So, Administratum, we're looking at bureaucrats. I mean, some stories from history, or some accounts from history, were simply made by bureaucrats like this. But what made them great, or what made them so insightful, is because they imbued their creativity into it. Because you're not supposed to put your emotions, your feelings, or creativity into a report. Let's see how they see it in their own eyes.
These many transcription chambers sat Jacob Maltinus and 12 other scribes. It was the scribe's job to shift through the towering stacks of records, manuscript summaries, correspondence reports, regulation amendments, and every other form of bureaucratic minutia. No matter how much work they do, no matter how many long nights they spend cataloging pointless records,
it's
their efforts
unending.
never seem to make a dent in the mountainous piles of parchment. The transcription chamber itself was drab and gloomy, illuminated by a series of tall candelabras and a single dull lumen globe that sat in the center of the long table before.
Doesn't this just wanna make you... They did this study. Right? For some reason, media has always portrayed office job as this nightmare of a never-ending slog that you're supposed to just get through. But if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves me right, some of the happiest people actually work in jobs like these. You clock in, you clock out, and then you enjoy yourself. But of course, there's none of that in the Warhammer 40K universe. You can't live for the weekend. You can't be a weekend warrior. You can't live for your hobbies. Unless, of course, you're rich. Because that's how you get through it, guys. It's a job. No one's supposed to enjoy their jobs. Unless, of course, you're... I mean, even rock stars and actors. That's why they get into so much trouble. At a certain point, you're going to crack. At a certain point, the strain is going to bear down on you. I mean, that's why in the first story, she turned to madness, she turned to drugs, she turned to alcohol. But here, in real life, I mean, the secret seems to be just, living for the weekend or living for the hobbies. That's why weekend warriors tend to be the happiest. You just clock out, forget everything else, and then go home, enjoy yourself. I mean, that's why I'm here. I'm here to basically enjoy these stories with you guys. See it as a job, see it as something that you need to get through, and then go home and enjoy yourself.
For them, the light they cast was flickering and just barely strong enough to read by. The air stank of acrid smoke, burning animal tallow, and dusty parchment. Overhead could be seen a series of hovering servo skulls that both monitored the scribes for faltering productivity and endlessly moved bundles of documents to and fro. Records the skulls deemed important based upon scrupulous criteria known only to them would be archived and preserved. Those that failed to impress them were moved to bins marked for incineration. Hakob reached forward and plucked a report from a nearby stack. The record was 50 years old and detailed the notable decline in vermin populations within the Underhive after AgriWorld shipments had slowed to a crawl and the dregs within.
My God, imagine the backlog. Well, that's bureaucracy at work for you. Remember, you're not here for the job, you're here for yourself, you're here for the salary. You live for the weekend, you live for your loved ones, you live for your hobbies. Well, you live for love. And no one definitely loves any of this. It's a paycheck, you guys.
Then had turned to eating rats in order to survive. He grabbed another, this one also multiple decades out of date. It documented the sale of mundane goods between two merchants that Hakob speculated were almost surely dead by now. He knew that they didn't have much time left here. The Imperium was under siege, and the great furnaces of Fumus had long since burned out. Every year that went by, more and more of the planet's important personnel had been ferried off-world and assigned to new posts somewhere else within the Imperium. Soon, it would be completely abandoned. To add even further insult to the drudgery of Hakob's existence, he knew that no one would ever read any of these reports.
Which is the saddest part of all. I mean, isn't that what school is? You're simply reading stuff that no one would read otherwise. So apparently scribes aren't important enough, or record keeping wasn't important enough to get ferried off-world first.
The Imperium didn't care about this world, its history, or any of those left behind to shift through its carcass for something of value. But
see, this is what that he was saying, or this is what we were talking about in the first place. We're all seeing the Warhammer 40K universe on a macro level. Why would it care about one solitary planet? Why would it care about a single individual? But now we are looking into the nitty-gritty of it all. We are looking to the basic unit, which is the human being. Hopefully he's a human being.
But to the Administratum, none of that mattered. All records, no matter how trivial, could not be ignored. All must be cataloged. No matter how much he hated this place and the work that he was forced to do, Hakob was thankful for something to keep him distracted. You see, tonight wasn't just an ordinary night for him. It was one that marked a dual anniversary of one of the happiest moments in his life, and also the saddest. This was both the 30-year anniversary of the sacred union between he and his wife Velia, but also, in a cruel twist of fate, the 20-year anniversary of the day she and their twin boys, Balin and Euless, were taken away from him by the Imperial War.
See, this is what I was talking about. You live for love, right? You don't live for the job. It's what keeps him going.
Machine. The twins had been barely 10 years old. They should have been considered too young to fight, but Fumus's population had been steadily dwindling for many decades, so when the tithes came for them, Velia and the children were conscripted into service. Hakob had never considered himself a brave man, but on that day, he would have given anything and faced any horror to go with them. But he was weak, his body plagued by arthritis and cursed with a set of lungs and a heart that never properly developed in the womb, leaving him frequently short of breath and
So he didn't get drafted for medical reasons. Is it because he was also a scribe? That's why he was left in this world?
unfit for combat. Despite this, all were expected to serve, and Akab's talents were determined best fulfilled as an administratum scribe, and that he should be patient in his sacrifice. Of course he was proud of them,
All
for
must
what greater
serve.
honor was there than to fight in protection of the Imperium? But even still, it hadn't kept him from mourning their absence. Every day of every year, he found himself momentarily distracted, overwhelmed by that deep and familiar sense of melancholy that he felt whenever he thought of his family. And it was in that moment that he heard something he hadn't heard in many years. A voice, just barely a whisper in his ear, that turned his blood to ice. He turned around and squinted against the chamber's gloom. There before him,
Is it me? Or are these people? I don't know, it could be chaos. Please put it down in the comments. But there seemed to be a pattern of people hearing voices. I guess if you're stuck in a world like this, you're bound to hear things.
was a shadow, a darkened silhouette of a woman that was eerily motionless despite the flickering candlelight that caused all other shadows to writhe against the walls. Although female in appearance and undeniably humanoid, there was something wrong about it. The shade was strangely angular, with proportions that were off just ever so slightly to instill a deep sense of unease. There was nothing about it that would cause Akab to recognize this thing as his wife, but he knew in his heart that it was her, just like how that voice in his ear had been unmistakable, even if it
Oh my god, was his wife taken by chaos?
had been cold and distant, like the wind over fresh snow. He twisted around so violently in his seat that he knocked over a stack of parchment off of the table, drawing disapproving glares from the other scribes. He quickly looked down to make sure the damage was minimal, but when he looked back up, the shadow was gone. There was nobody there.
"What troubles you, Akab?"
Asked Arthur Tizian, one of his fellow scribes.
"It's nothing.
Maltinus said.
An archival reference I forgot to check."
He stood and walked slowly away from the table, heading in the direction the shadow seemed.
So guys, wherever you are, especially if you're at work, if you start to hear voices, deny everything, alright? If your boss or if your supervisor checks on you, are you alright? I'm perfectly fine, sir. That's the only proper question if you don't want to lose your job. Or that's the only proper answer if you don't want to lose your job. I'm alright, sir. But then again, after work, you should definitely get yourself checked out, okay? Just don't tell your bosses, I promise you. HR is not your friend.
To have come from.
It wasn't her. She can't have been here.
He made his way through the chamber, passing towering storage archives, each over 15 feet tall, with rail-mounted ladders to give access to their drawers. Servitors climbed all over them, retrieving and replacing documents. The chamber he was in was so vast that the grinding sound of moving ladders and
Wait a minute. Anyways, he figured out it was his wife. Was it his wife? We all see things that we want to see. And in almost all ghost stories out there, when in terms of possession or where demonic possession is involved, they would always say it's the demon in disguise that's trying to fool you or that's trying to trick you. So is this chaos in disguise? Is it one chaos god? I mean, there's a chaos trickster god, right? And someone put down the name of the chaos trickster god. I forgot his name.
and the slamming of drawers was swallowed by the space and reduced to a sound akin to distant falling pebbles in a dark, fathomless pool. A short distance in,
I mean,
he
it would
crossed
definitely
paths
make
with
sense,
Avelia
right?
Revican, who
It would make sense that it's the date of their anniversary. He's missing his wife and kids. So it would only make sense that he's going to see his wife, or this monster or this demon is going to show him that here's your wife. Come.
who nodded in greeting. "Marking your day with thanks and contemplation, Maltinus?" she asked. Avelia had been assigned to the administratum via the tithe at the same time that Akab had. Just like she too had seen her family conscripted into the Imperium's armed forces, and thus the two of them had formed a bond through shared pride and grief. At this point, she was the closest thing he had to what someone would consider a
You're
friend
never
in this
coming
dreadful
home ever
place.
again.
Oh, I am. I trust you are too.
Maltinus asked, distracted, looking past her. My thoughts are with Velia and your sons, but the Emperor protects, brother.
The Emperor protects,
he answered, smiling weakly, and moved on. The Emperor protects. It was a phrase
It feels like he can't even trust his friends.
he had heard many times repeated throughout his life, one that brought comfort to billions in the dark times the Imperium was now going through. The hope that was embedded in that promise kept Akab's spirit alive, even if he had no way of knowing where his family was or what they were being forced to do or even what horrifying monstrosity they would have to face. He knew in his soul that the God Emperor was watching over them, that he would protect them and one day guide them all back together. He hadn't heard from them in 20 years, but he had to believe in this dream. It was the only thing continuing to give his existence meaning. Without the Emperor's promise, he might as well have just been another lobotomized servitor.
What am I even doing? There was no one there. I'm just imagining things.
No sooner had he uttered those words than he saw movement out of the corner of his right eye.
There we go.
Something was at the far end of one of the paths. He kept his head still, but shifted his gaze in its direction. There was another shadow, one much
One
smaller
of his
than the
sons.
last. Though it had no eyes or face to speak of, he could tell it was watching him. He turned the rest of the way, but as he did, the shade vanished. Once again, there was nobody there. But he knew that wasn't true. He had seen it. There was no doubt in his mind. It had been one of his twin boys. But then, to his horror, he realized he didn't know which one it had been.
See, that was the thing, right? It's showing him a child version of his boys. Because hopefully those boys had time to grow up, at least just a smidge, in order to be trained or in order to actually hold the last guns. But no. I mean, it couldn't have been this entity or what this demon or whatever it is. It's trying to show him what he wants. At least that's how I interpret it. His wife and his sons have been gone for a long time. And even if those boys managed to grow up, he wouldn't know how they look like, all grown up.
With a piercing shame, Balin and Ulis had blurred in his memory into a single being. If he saw them today, he knew he wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Further, he realized if that somehow happened, if they suddenly appeared before him, they would both be men in their early 30s. But there was no
that's what I was
mistaking
talking
it.
about.
That shadow had been cast by a child. He was seeing things. He was hearing things. He'd allowed his grief to cloud his mind, and now he was seeing specters and ghosts, ones conjured from old, half-forgotten memories that didn't even have the decency to be the proper age.
He wouldn't know how they'd look like at 30. They were 10 last time he saw them.
With a sigh, he realized he had been away from his post for too long. He needed to head back, lest one of the servo skulls become agitated by his absence and report him to the overseer.
Oh.
But even so, after a quick glance around, he knew he wouldn't be able to shake this if he didn't at least make some small attempt at investigating to clear his troubled thoughts. He walked down the aisle and approached where he had seen the child's shadow. One of the drawers near the bottom of the archive unit had been left open. He looked inside and saw a large stack of unsorted documents, a labor that he realized would be waiting for him another day, or perhaps another year. He reached down and picked up the top sheet of vellum. It was an accident report, originating from a place Akab had never heard of called Volgast. The troop transport, the Exaltation of Faith, had had sealants.
Volgast? Is that part of the lore? Did something happen in Volgast that's meant to be part of the Warhammer 40K lore? Can someone please put it down in the comments? It sounds very familiar. Because that's how they build from these things. You basically spin off of one story to in order to make a new one.
On the ship's plasma reactor, documented as being faulty and fractured. The supervising tech priest had ordered them to be replaced. Yet, according to the accident report, there had been a transcription error, and the sealants had, instead of being registered as in need of replacement, were registered as having already been replaced. This resulted in the ship leaving port with the flaw unattended to. She had survived as long as her first warp jump, but when she...
So, again, it's the bureaucracy's fault. Because how bureaucracy work, at least IRL, you basically submit a document or report to bureaucrat A, and then after that bureaucrat A does his or her job, you pass it on to bureaucrat B, and so on and so forth until it reaches the right people. So imagine from bureaucrat A to Z, someone was lazy, someone was had a day off, someone didn't do their job properly, and that's how things like these happen. Something almost always goes wrong as it goes down or up the chain.
She attempted to translate back into real space. There had been a rupture in the plasma engines, causing a white-hot inferno.
Wait, is there a possibility that his wife and children were on this ship?
To race through the ship's decks, incinerating all aboard. He scanned his eyes across the document until he reached the bottom and froze. There was the incident report's date, indicating that this tragic accident had occurred only a few weeks shy of 20 years ago. Macabre felt a chill run up his spine and a foreboding sense of dread looming over his shoulders.
His wife and kids were on that ship
until he found a long column of confirmed casualties. There, listed amongst the dead, were the names Velia Maltinus, Balin Maltinus, and Eulis Maltinus. His mouth gaped, his throat closed in grief, and the scream that shook his body emerged only as a
bad way to find out.
They had died 20 years ago, and their death.
And he didn't 20 years ago. They died 20 years ago, and he didn't even know it. Well, that's bureaucracy for you.
This had meant nothing. They had not perished as heroes fighting in the name of the Imperium.
Nope.
They were victims of a stupid mistake. Their tragedy
exactly.
bearing no more importance than any of the other documents he spent his night shifting through. It was a single.
So again, we are looking at the stories of the people that keeps the Imperium going. And sadly, the Imperium doesn't care enough about them at all. Oh my god, what a realistic horror story. That people died because someone didn't do their job. Or someone simply didn't care enough to do their job properly.
Single loss amongst many, an incident barely worth noting. The names clouded before him as he felt his eyes welling up with tears. He slumped back against the archive unit. The parchment crumbled in his trembling, clawed hands. Scribe Maltinus, you are damaging an Imperial document.
Screw you, bitch.
Macabre jerked upright, his breath hitching. Overseer Terracin stood at the end of the aisle. She was a stern and unflinching woman, foreboding and pitiless as iron.
I was...
Macabre stammered, barely able to think. Return to your post at once.
Yes, Overseer.
Everything in Macabre's world began to blur. He had no conscious memory of returning to his labor, yet he must have, as he found himself once again sorting through documents. It was as if his body was on autopilot, for there was no room in his mind for anything other than anguish and overwhelming.
So he stepped back into his coping mechanism, which is work. Well, can be as good as any.
Sense of meaninglessness and rage. He felt rage at a galaxy that would reduce every dream to ash. Rage at the lie he had lived for 20 years, and the lie that everyone in his life mindlessly repeated. Those empty, hollow words. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects.
No,
the Emperor didn't protect.
The refrain tormented him throughout the drudgery of the day and pursued him still after nightfall, as he made the long walk through the dark and bitter cold towards his...
Is this how chaos enters a person? Can someone please put it down in the comments?
His quarters. The streets here were narrow, squeezed...
I mean, he's ticking off a lot of the boxes. Loneliness, rage, and all that other good stuff that chaos gods feed upon.
Between high, decaying hab towers, the pavement and the facades were grimy from the soot and smoke that choked the air. Filthy gray smog rolled through the alleys.
They're going to leave him there.
Not see more than a few yards
ahead. It's not important enough.
Snow fell in thick, sodden flakes that left black smears where they landed on his cheeks and slid down like thick tears. He had none left of his own. The grief was too big, and so was the hate. As this Forge World's resources continued to dwindle, so too did its population. At this point, the sector he lived in was almost completely deserted. Entire hab blocks now stood abandoned, their windows as broken and dark as the blind sockets of skulls. Even within his own building, no more than 1/10 of the units were occupied, and he was the only inhabitant on the 6th floor. Because of this, he was used to being by himself in the streets on his journey home. But on this night, As he walked the path he had done so many times over the years, he realized that he wasn't alone. He could hear the sounds of
You guys noticed no dead bodies yet? I mean, if you compare it to the first story where we start off with the murder scene.
footsteps coming from his left and his right, echoing along beside
Heresy!
him. He turned, and though half hidden by the fog, about a block away on both sides, he could see the shadow of one of his twins. They stopped moving when he did, and when he strained to look at them, they disappeared, their silhouette carried off by soot and snow. But when he turned away and resumed walking, the footsteps returned. The twins kept pace with him, always lurking at the edge of his vision.
There we go.
Always watching him, always judging.
They're not really there.
Why are they judging
They're just
him?
what I want to
It wasn't
see.
his fault.
This conviction did nothing to ease his growing fear, nor his suffocating grief. It merely highlighted that the featureless shadows were wrought from his fading memories and his inability to distinguish the identity of his own children. Although he couldn't see her, he knew his wife was here too, always behind him, always gone whenever he turned to look. All he could see was what
There
was
we
in front
go.
of him, the long shadow she cast that blanketed over him in silent, oppressive judgment.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But it's been so long, Velia. I'll remember you though. Oh, won't you let me see you?
He said to the ghost of his wife. To see her again, to see all of them one more time, was all that had kept him going for the last 20 years, and now he knew that would never happen.
Nope.
There was nothing to support his profound loneliness. An endless void of mourning opened before him. He collapsed to his knees, unable to go on.
One more time.
He cried out into the empty night.
I'd give anything to see you. All of you.
And there
One
we
last
go.
time.
There's
Was
the
not
fact.
the emperor he prayed to.
He's
as
offering
the pain
his soul.
Of his betrayal and broken promise was far too great. Even still,
To
the
other
perversity
gods,
of his loved
except
one's
the one
death
that abandoned
and
him.
strange chance discovery of
The
that
one that
report
abandoned
was
his
too
wife and
strong
children.
for him to believe that there was no controlling hand at work. It had been no coincidence. Something had guided him towards the truth. There was a will here, an omnipotent consciousness at work, a shaper of fate. Though the words escaped his lips as no more than a cracked whisper, the impact they had amidst the still night air felt strong enough to carve deep furrows through the rockcrete of the abandoned hab block.
Grant me this boon.
He prayed to that shaper.
Let me see them one more time.
There we
The
go. There's
moment
the
he
fact.
formulated
There's the
prayer,
contract.
The shadows vanished, and a heavy silence fell over the surrounding area. He was once again completely alone, without even the figments conjured by his grieving mind for company. He sat there, listening to the silence for several minutes, before he realized how foolish he was being. He was about to get up and continue on to his hab block when he heard something off in the distance. A heavy, dragging tread that broke the silence. He slowly turned around and stared into the swirling dark of the night as the noise drew closer and closer. Whatever it was big and clumsy. In one moment, it sounded like it stood on 2 feet and was limping, dragging an injured leg across the rockcrete, whereas at other times, it sounded fast and disorganized, a rapid pattern echoing off the walls between steps. The thing in the darkness screamed. It bellowed in both pain and anger, and sounded like a woman, or some horrible abomination attempting to mimic a woman. He didn't stick around to find out. He leapt to his feet and ran. He knew that whatever this thing was, he must not see it. He ran faster than he had ever done before, even in his youth. His heart hammered out a painful, irregular beat.
I wonder
and
if the
his faulty
contract was
lungs
accepted.
rasped wetly with the effort of
His
drawing
soul
breath.
just to see his
He was
family
running
again.
on pure adrenaline. But despite how fast he was moving, he could hear the heavy, lumbering footfalls and disjointed, inhuman screaming drawing closer and closer. He reached the rusty, flaking entrance of his hab block, threw open the door to the stairwell, and blindly staggered up the 6 flights of stairs. Even before he reached the top, he could hear the thing below him beginning to climb. It thumped and slipped, slithered and prowled, each amalgamous movement echoing up after a cob. The scream came again, but this time it was changing. It was more of a wail, a choking, gargling growl of both anguish and hatred, like a half-formed throat trying desperately to form human words and failing utterly. He threw open the door to his floor and stumbled down the dark hall towards his apartment, his hands pressed firmly against his ears, desperate to block out the thing's horrible cries. The lumen strips overhead barely functioned. They flickered and pulsed a sickly gray light that struggled and failed to push back the darkness. He reached his door and with trembling hands fumbled with his keys as he heard the door to the stairwell at the end of the hall begin to creak open. He was sobbing now as he finally managed to slam the correct key into the plasteel door and unlock it. He threw himself inside, shut the door behind him, and locked it again. Gasping for breath, Hakab slowly backed away from the entryway and listened intently for the sounds of movement on the other side. The thing was in the hallway now, shambling ever closer towards him. He heard a hand, or what he assumed to be a hand, scraping on the other side of the door before it began to fumble with the handle. He froze like prey in the presence of a hungry predator. There was a long moment of silence, and just as he dared to let himself hope that the thing had moved on, there was a massive booming crash as the door flew open, knocked completely off its hinges as if struck with inhuman strength.
The contract was accepted.
He stared through the entryway into the gaping void of darkness beyond, and out of the abyss stepped the horror, and for the first time, he got a good look at his pursuer. His wish had been granted.
There
the
we go.
changer of ways who watched over those abandoned by the Emperor had answered his prayers. There before him was his family. It was the one last look at them he had asked for. His wife.
This is why you don't deal with the devil, you guys. It will grant you, but only in the sickest way. What's the name of that trickster god again? Please put it down. Is this the trickster chaos god? This is why you don't deal. Apparently, yes. It accepted the contract. It showed him his family, but in the worst possible way.
Wife and children had returned to him, but they had come back wrong, fused into a single being. Velya staggered forward, her steps heavy with the weight of her sons melded with her torso. Their legs scrabbled for purchase on the floor, sometimes finding it, sometimes not. 3 pairs of arms stretched out, hands clawing to reach Hakab. The heads of the boys melted into Velya's lower jaw.
It showed them it showed them in the form of their final moment.
Distorted maw. The flesh of the monster was burned black. Crisp pieces of it broke off at Hakab's feet. The maw opened wide, and at last the scream became words. You did this! Hakab's family screamed, 6 eyes fixed upon him, hating him and his wish that had brought them back to this agony. And then they were upon him, dragging him into the mass. His screams were muffled quickly in the nightmare of reunion.
Holy crap. Thank you for watching, guys. Now you all know the drill. Please like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit that notification button. It would help me out greatly with the YouTube algo. Now, if you guys want me to check out other stories, please let me know in the comments. We upload on YouTube every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard. And we go live on Twitch. Please check us out at 8 p.m. every Wednesday and Sunday Eastern Standard. Now, class dismissed.